Um, so it's really great to see you all again. I was curious how many people have been here, like for at least more than one. How many have you? Oh, wow. Okay, anybody been here for all three? Wow, okay, great. And anybody here for the first time tonight? I think a few of you are. Okay, well, very warm welcome to all of you. We're so glad to have you here. And every evening we're doing this, it is so encouraging to me, who has been working on climate change for some years now, just to see that there are other people who are concerned and wanting, hopefully, to get involved. This is the Climate Action Series. You all saw that, right? Okay. And I should also say happy St. Patrick's and acknowledge that you gave up your St. Patrick's evening to be here, so we appreciate that. Okay, and my name is Linda Hamilton. I'm the Redlands coordinator for the program that's a new program in Redlands. It's called Accelerate Neighborhood Climate Action. But for short, we say ANCA, A-N-C-A, okay? So this is a program that brings climate action down to the neighborhood level. That's where everyone can be involved, where individual actions can become collective action, and where everybody can make a difference. So this speaker series is really a call to action because we are in a climate emergency. How many of you actually know that, feel that? Wow, that's why you're here. Okay. I'm happy to see that. But yet I think you'll probably agree with this, that we are more or less kind of living our lives as though everything were still pretty normal, right? Yeah. So anyway, last week I talked a little bit about all the warnings that scientists have given us. And I had an image I wanted to share with you tonight, but we don't actually have access to it. But it is a graph that goes like this. And along it is plotted some of these warnings and also many of the conferences that have been held, worldwide conferences, to try to come up with a plan to reduce carbon emissions. The chart starts back in 1960 and goes up to 1920. And so, and it's plotted on the line showing how carbon emissions have gone up. So despite all of those gatherings, all of that effort, our carbon emissions are still going up very, very quickly. And yeah, and that doesn't even include all the COP meetings. You know, you just heard about COP26, right? COP stands for Conference of the Parties. The weird kind of name, isn't it? But anyway, those are becoming more and more significant. Yeah, and so when our world leaders are not acting like this is an emergency, it's hard for everybody else to do that, right? But I think when we see clearly what is at stake, which I think everybody here pretty much does, and how quickly things are deteriorating, there's no doubt that this is an emergency. And it's on a scale unlike any other emergency, right? So tonight we're going to be talking about one of the impacts of climate change, and that is the increasing heat in the world, and particularly here in Redlands. What a great week when temperatures are in the 80s, right? For the next 10 days, I think. And we particularly want to focus on how we can prepare for increasing heat as individuals, as families, and as neighborhoods. So we want to begin by asking you to turn to the person next to you, again, hopefully not the person that you drove here with, and just share with that person your name and the thing that most concerns you about the increasing heat, okay? In our area particularly, and think about all of the things. Think about all the things that heat does impact. You have 1 minute. Becky's going to ring a bell. Time. Where is he?
I was in the back. some points when you are feeling people are convinced
That was the bell, folks. Time to change. Okay, that was the bell. So let's take just a moment to hear from just a few of you. What was one concern that you shared about the increasing heat in our area? One thing, anybody? Yes?
Concerned about birds and insects.
About the effect on birds and insects. Yeah. Yeah. And humans too, yes. Okay. Another concern about our increasing heat. Mm-hmm.
The pollution is getting worse.
Pollution, yes. There's definitely a connection there, isn't there? One more? Mm-hmm.
Increase in population means increase in heat, more cars.
Okay, okay, yeah. All righty, thank you guys. So I feel like I need to say a little bit about ANCA for people, especially for people who are here for the first time. Some of you have been here for 3 times now, can probably stand up here and give this one of these days. But ANCA is a neighborhood-based program, and we hope to be engaging neighborhoods in a planning process called Climate Action Forums, and to come up with concrete actions or plans for reducing carbon emissions and building a more resilient neighborhood. And being climate resilient really means being better prepared for the impacts of climate change, right? And we also want to continue to provide educational opportunities for our community to learn more about climate change. There are still a lot of people out there that really don't know that much. I think you'd agree with that. And then also how we begin to deal with this rapidly changing world that we're all facing these days. So that's our ongoing educational program. ANCA is guided by a local steering committee that has helped launch the program, and I'd like again to introduce any members in this who happen to be in the room right now. Would you just stand up, please, so I can introduce you? There's Baljeet Tour, Diane Landeros in the back. Anybody else in the room? Mario Saseto's here. Anybody else? Some are still out there at the registration table. So we've very much appreciated their help during this time. And we have a number of other organizations that are lending support of various kinds to the program. They include the City of Redlands, the University of Redlands, Environmental Studies Department, the Smiley Library, and Esri. And last but not least, I hear we have at least one local official in the audience by the name of Eddie. Eddie, are you there? You are. What are you doing? Come on, Eddie. Would you like to say just a word to the group?
Hi.
That was a word. We are really happy to have you here, Eddie. Thank you so much for coming. All right. So our agenda for tonight. We're going to start off with our panel, as usual, 3 people. These are short presentations, so they can't cover everything, but we hope that it's enough to get you thinking and also just to get the conversation started. Then we'll follow that with a Q&A, and then a brief guided discussion, and then we'll have our closing. And then after that, the most important time, which is our getting acquainted time. We hope you will stay for that. And do some of the activities that we have over here and just get acquainted with your neighbors. So we want to introduce our speakers for tonight, but before I ask Baljeet to come up to do that, I want to explain just briefly again about the panel. Each of the 4 panels this month has one person from the university, one from the city, and one from ANCA. So each of these entities has something very important to bring to the table, and has something important, I think, that can contribute to this climate emergency. And then there is a 4th entity, and that is you. Your involvement is one of the most important things. Anything that's done by the city, that's done by the university, that's done by a nonprofit really needs the support of the residents to be effective. So that's why we're so excited that you're here tonight. And with that, I think I'd like to ask Baljeet to come up and introduce our speakers for tonight. Baljeet.
Thank you, Linda. My name is Baljeet Tour. I'm a member of ANCA Steering Committee. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to introduce our honorable guests today. First, I want to welcome and want to thank you taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this lecture. The title of this today's Climate Action Series lecture is Heat. We have 3 panelists today. Our first speaker will be Martin Hoyker Martinez. Is an associate professor of physics at the University of Redlands. His current research is split between thermal stratification in the Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve and urban estuary in Huntington Beach, California, and laboratory scale geographical dynamics models flows influenced by the Earth's rotation. At the University of Redlands, he has taught courses on fluid mechanics, weather, and climate in addition to courses in the standard physics curriculum. Prior to joining the faculty, he was a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Michigan, where he modeled atmospheric flows over the Southern Ocean. During his PhD at Oregon State University, he modeled the transfer of heat, fresh water in the surface layers of the equatorial Indian Ocean. Before his PhD work in oceanography, Martin worked on novel fuel cell materials at the California Institute of Technology, where he earned an MS in applied physics. Our second speaker will be Brian Foote. Brian Foote, I hope I'm pronouncing the right last name right. Brian Foote is the city planning manager for the city of Redlands and oversees development review, long-range planning, historic preservation program, and implementation of the city's general plan. He has 20 years of experience working for California cities. He is a member of the American Planning Association and a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, the Professional Institute of APA. He volunteers his time with APA's Urban Design and Preservation Division's current chair in 2021 and 22, and also volunteers with the several local community services organizations. He has a Master of Urban and Regional Planning degree from Cal Poly Pomona and expects to graduate with a Master of Public Affairs degree in August 2022 from the University of Missouri, Columbia. Our third speaker, Tyra Delcher. Tyra Delcher is a biologist and environmental planner who has done significant work in climate resilience. She has a bachelor's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Colorado and Masters of Science in Environmental Management from the University of San Francisco. Now I will invite our first speaker, Martin Hoyker Martinez, to the podium. Thank you very much.
Good evening. So I'm I'm Martinez. It's a pleasure to be here. And I guess we'll start the next slide to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about today. So my job here as the sort of academic is to give you a background of what is and sort of what sort of reasonable sort of models project sort of as reasonable sort of futures going forward. And to do that, I'm going to probably bore you a bit and sort of give you the background of just the basic idea of what the causes of climate change are, give you a brief overview of observations of the global temperature. I'm an oceanographer by training, and so I'm gonna, if you'll indulge me, I'll at least talk a little bit about how the oceans are heating in and of themselves. Then I'll switch over and talk about a little bit of what it means, what it means when we say climate, and talk about sort of what that means sort of when we talk about sort of a changing normal. And then I'll talk about the limitations when we talk about forecasting climate, and talk about sort of what the IPCC uses for sort of the various sort of future scenarios to predict things forward, give you ideas to invest in more cases. And at the end, sort of talk about some more local things that sort of also affect the local temperature, and talk about some urban heat islands. So go to the next slide, please. So when I think of climate change and the greenhouse effect, I like to think of it as a leaky bucket. The sun is a hose that's pouring water into my bucket, and my bucket has a hole in the bottom. And if I have enough water pouring in the hose, the level of the bucket will get up to a certain point, and then eventually sort of if the hole's big enough, it'll stop at a set level. If I slowly plug the hole, the sort of equilibrium level of the bucket will get a little higher, a little higher, a little higher. And so this is a visual representation of sort of the top of the bucket and the hole on the side. So the hole at the top of the bucket where the hose is coming in, that is the sun dumping energy on the earth. And that is why we look outside, we see, and there's plenty of sunlight shining down on the earth. The earth itself is also, because it has some temperature, it also radiates that temperature out. But it radiates at a different wavelength, a different essentially color of light. And so that different color of light interacts differently with the molecules of the air than the color of light that comes from the sun. It turns out that so you can sort of see the sort of two curves here. In the red is sort of that incoming bucket, and then the blue is the outgoing hole. Next slide, please. So oftentimes, and actually this slide, these two images I actually took from a NASA page talking about how they use satellites to look through the atmosphere. That sort of outgoing blue radiation is what's referred to as the atmospheric window. It is a range of different wavelengths of light that can readily escape the atmosphere. And you'll notice, you see sort of notches in that outgoing light. In fact, sort of the next graph underneath, that's in some sense sort of how absorptive the atmosphere is. So I'll give you sort of extreme examples here. Sort of off to the left, the extreme left, is ultraviolet light. So that's sort of like the ozone layer. So these are the reason why ultraviolet light can cause cancer, such as because it interacts strongly with atoms and molecules, and so it is readily absorbed. It is absorbed significantly by the atmosphere. Visible light is not as readily absorbed, so it makes it down. We can see, and it's great. But you see in the gray there are these absorption bands that basically are the fingerprints of different chemicals in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. This is now a zoomed-in picture of the hole in the bucket. This is the light that's actually pouring, the light that's carrying heat away from the earth. And here they've labeled sort of, the red would be what you would expect if there was no atmosphere, but the earth had a temperature of 294 Kelvin, which is on the order of 21 degrees Celsius. And the blue, you see the blue almost fills in the red, but there are some gaps. And those gaps are filled in basically because there are different chemicals in the atmosphere that readily interact with those colors of light. In particular, I'll draw your attention to the big notch in the middle. It's labeled as CO2, right? So this is us filling that hole in the bottom of the bucket, right? So the water can't rush out quite as fast. So the water level of the bucket is just a little higher. And to some extent, that is a useful thing. The Earth is as warm as it is because there is some CO2 in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. But that amount of CO2 is not constant. So what's plotted up there is from 1975 until 2020, the amount of CO2 measured at various stations around the Earth. The wiggliest line, that blue line, looks like it's sort of jumping up and down like a frog as it slowly climbs up the hill. That's a station up in Barrow, Alaska. And the calmest one that's sort of just barely sort of steadily inching up, that's a station at the South Pole. There's some really cool, interesting sort of biology going on here. It turns out that up and down that you see on top, like the hopping, that's in the fall when all the leaves fall. And they rot, they let out CO2. In the spring, new leaves come and they suck in CO2. So there are variations, there are natural variations in CO2. It seems like they might be smaller than some other cause of a variation though, so for example. Next slide, please. So, talk about CO2, I've talked about sort of my leaky bucket. This is the water level in the bucket. This is a global average of temperature. The blue line is the actual year-by-year data, and the gold line is simply, they took sort of a 5-year sort of smooth average, so you don't sort of, like you have sort of one particularly anomalous here, it doesn't sort of draw it up very significantly. But hopefully you see a trend? Yay? Okay, just making sure. All right, next slide, please. Turns out that the atmosphere is not the only place you see this trend. What I'm showing here is some data from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, where they actually have a set of measurements from the ocean. So one of the ways they do it, they have these little things that look like basically torpedoes, but all they have is a little balloon on the end. Balloon fills up, it floats to the top, sends home whatever measurements it took, deflates the balloon, goes back down and floats way down at depth, and it measures the temperature all the way up and all the way down. And so we have, these are relatively, for scientific instruments, cheap to do. And so basically, whenever time a research ship goes out, oftentimes they'll take some of these and they'll throw them overboard on their way to go do some other more sort of extensive science. And they just drift around the ocean. But because of that program and other sort of programs measuring the temperature of the ocean, I'll let you know the reason we care a lot about the temperature of the ocean. It affects how sound travels in the ocean. And the Navy cares about that a whole lot for some reason. I mean, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that my friends get funding for it. But, so we've taken these measures for a very long time. With the advent of these sort of robotic measurements, we have enough of them to actually do some sort of global average. And these lines are colored by how deep they are in the ocean. And you notice that the whole ocean is getting warmer, but the top is getting warmer faster. The reason for this, you actually might understand pretty well. Imagine you work at a diner, and someone orders some soup, but they forget to pick it up, so they leave it under the hot lamp. The hot lamp just heats the top of the soup, right? What's going to happen to the bottom of the soup? Is it going to get warmer? Not really, right? So the atmosphere and the ocean are a little different. The atmosphere is heated from underneath, right? The sunshine goes basically straight through the atmosphere, absorbed at the surface, which heats up the air and heats it, and so it bubbles up just like you're, heating up your soup on the stove. This is why you put your soup in a pot. The ocean, getting heat deep down in the ocean takes a longer time. This is one of the things that slows down how the Earth responds to cranking up CO2. The oceans are really big, right? And so it takes a long time for sort of heating to actually get to a point where it's actually fully sort of soaked into the ocean. Next slide, please. That said, there's already a lot of heat in the ocean. This is basically averaging together all of those things, so it's like how much energy has been dumped in the ocean over the past 60 years. And just like the atmosphere, I hope you see a trend. All right, next slide, please. So I've got next is, as much as sort of the oceans is sort of, for example, we'll sort of go through here and talk to some individual stations. So here's sort of Buenos Aires. You can see it's getting warmer. So roll through these slides a bit faster here. Nagasaki, Japan, getting warmer. Next slide, please. This is a station up in Iceland that I'm not going to try to pronounce. Getting warmer. Get a little closer to home. Long Beach, maybe getting warmer. Next slide, please. Riverside, maybe getting warmer. Next slide, please. Pomona, getting warmer. So I'm going to talk about getting warmer. I should sort of differentiate sort of this idea of climate and defining sort of what is normal. So I should talk about sort of what climate really is sort of, what do you expect the temperature to be at on any given day, right? What do you expect it to be on March the 17th? What's a normal high? What would be a hot day on 17th? What would be a cold day? What would be a rainy day? What would be a dry day? So, next slide, please. There's a weather station in Redlands that's been operating since the 1890s. The top is the average high, the bottom is the average low. Do you notice a trend locally? The colors get brighter as you go later in the year. Dark blue, light yellow. It's getting warmer here. And not just in a clearly measurable way. Next slide, please. And I'll roll through. So this is a relationship between sort of CO2 and temperature. They are linked. Next slide, please. This is probably where I'll stop, sort of get to our next speaker, have time. So this is a picture of how many days it's above 95 in the western United States. On the left, 1960. On the right, 2100. Those middle dark bands, that's July and August. It should be warm in July and August, right? By 2100, it should be warm in June, July, August, and September. This is sort of what climate change looks like. It is the weather you expect in a given month is going to be warmer. And I put 95 degrees because if it's warmer than 95 degrees out, we're starting to worry about people getting heat stroke, right? We're starting to worry about sort of whether it's safe to work outside. This is where the real impacts. All right, in the interest of time, I think I'll cut it off and I'll let the next speaker go on.
Good evening, thank you. I'm Brian Foote. I work for the city as a city planner, and I have a few slides here that will begin to tie into the presentation you just saw a moment ago, and then I'm going to transition into a topic that I work with locally, and that is wildfire. Climate change has various types of impacts. In the western U.S., it's drought. Other parts of the world, it's more precipitation. And then, of course, wildfire is another impact. So because of the area that I work in, I'm going to focus on that particular topic, wildfire. Next slide, please. So just a few brief slides to sort of restate what we just heard. The increase in the average heat is one element of climate change. And that's the upper temperatures, so the 90 and 100 degree temperatures. Next slide, please. And another way to think of it is the variation, the variance. The hotter months are now extending further into the spring and into the fall. If you can recall, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, the really hot weather didn't start until maybe June or July. Now it begins in May, where we have several days of 90s and some 100-degree weather. And then at the other end of the summer, the hot weather extends into October and even November now. Whereas maybe 30 or 40 years ago, that didn't extend past September or mid-October. So there's not only the increase in heat, but also the extended season of hot weather. Next slide, please. Here are some slides that I borrowed from a U.S. Forest Service presentation from a couple of years ago. They focused specifically on California. So I thought these were really interesting because these focus on just our region. And I'm not going to get into all the dots and the lines and the regression analysis, but just notice the trend lines. The trend lines are increasing for heat and decreasing for precipitation. Next slide, please. And same for the future projections. The trend is projected to continue increasing, as well as the variation, the variance in the heat, the increased heat and the variation in heat. Next slide, please. There was a recent report from UCLA, just released not too long ago, that analyzed extreme fire weather in California. And since the 1980s, it's doubled. The extreme fire weather has doubled, and they're projecting that it will increase another 50 to 100%, so almost double again by the end of this century. So this is not a short-term problem. This is likely to be a problem that we have to deal with for a few decades moving forward. And of course, other implications for that are land uses and building in high fire hazard areas. And again, that's an area that I work in. In the planning side, I deal with current planning or development review, proposed construction projects, residential, commercial, and so forth. I also deal with long-range planning, so the general plan, the climate action plan, the policy documents that guide future development, and some other related areas. Emergency planning, I'm a little bit involved with local hazard mitigation planning with some other departments through the fire department. So this is a particular area that I have to work with here locally. So going back to our graph, it's this upper end of the spectrum here that we're concerned about, the increase in heat and the increased variance. Next slide, please. And this particular slide shows all of California. I just wanted to focus on our area here in Southern California around Redlands. You can see the red shading is increasing quite a bit, which indicates increasing heat and chances for wildfire. Next slide, please. Now, in the city's general plan, we have an exhibit called High Fire Hazard Area. As you can see, the red, orange, and darker yellow colors indicate the various categories of high fire hazard. Red is severe hazard, orange is very high hazard, and then the yellow is high threat hazard, and then the rest of the remainder of the city is moderate to low hazard. Next slide, please. And we have another exhibit showing just a close-up on the high fire hazard area. This is the southern side of town, in the hills in San Mateo Canyon specifically. The cutoff is about Highland Avenue, moving to the northwest, and then along Terracina Boulevard over by Loma Linda, and then down here is Riverside County. Essentially the hillside areas and the canyon areas, those tend to be higher risk for fire hazards. Next slide, please. There's a term called wildland-urban interface that's coming up more frequently in the planning world anyway, talking about how we are dealing with development in the wildland areas or encroachment, where new development, usually residential subdivisions, are building in the open land areas, which tend to be wildland areas. It's not just a problem in California, but with the western US. Colorado in particular has had recent fires. Oregon, other states have the same issue. And there's a gradient for wildland-urban interface. On the left is wildlands, and then moving over to rural and suburban, and then into the more typical higher density neighborhoods. It's just a way to think about the wildland-urban interface. Next slide, please. And in Redlands, this is an aerial of South Redlands. This is the San Mateo Canyon area. These are the hills. As you can see, there are some residential neighborhoods surrounded by hills in the high fire hazard area, built several decades ago before today's problem became apparent, but we do have some existing neighborhoods in the high fire hazard area. Next slide, please. And this is the southeasterly corner of the city. Yucaipa and Calamasa are to the right of the slide, but as you can see, the residential neighborhoods are built into the hillside areas, which are the high fire hazard area. Next slide, please. I think some of you, or maybe most of you, have seen some of the wildfires recently. This is what it looks like from a distance. Next slide, please. Locally, the San Bernardino forest has some issue with a lot of dead trees. There is an invasive, I believe it's a beetle, that have killed millions of trees in the forest, and so that is essentially turning the forest into fuel for potential wildfires. Next slide, please. And at some point, wildfires get really big, and once they get going, they're difficult to stop. Next slide, please. This is a slide of, I believe it was last year in the San Gabriel Valley in the Los Angeles area. They have the hills, of course, San Gabriel Mountains, and so this is what happens if a wildfire gets going. Next slide, please. It's kind of hard to describe. I saw this a little bit in San Bernardino in 2003 for the Waterman fire when I was working there. Obviously, it's a highly impactful event, highly impactful for neighborhoods and communities. Next slide, please. Referring back to the old Waterman fire in 2003, the fire started in the mountains and then came south into the city of San Bernardino. I just wanted to show this because one of the main things I remember is at some point during the event, the fire department was directed not to respond north of the 210 freeway because it was too high risk and they wouldn't be able to stop the fire. At some point, the risk and benefit analysis has to be done, and they used aircraft essentially to attack the fire in the mountains and in the northern neighborhoods north of the 210 freeway, which is about this area. But for most of the day, the fire department was just unable to respond. Next slide, please. So in the city of Redlands, the fire department has an emergency operations plan, a local hazard mitigation plan, and an emergency management plan. In my role, I have a small role in preparedness and mitigation, so establishing policies for how the city would handle an event like this. And then once an event happens, the planning phase is over with, it becomes response and then recovery. Next slide, please. In the Development Services Department, we have Planning Division, which we have land use planning, and environmental review and design review. So for example, on the planning side, when we get an application for, let's say, a new subdivision in a particular area of town, we review that against the general plan and the zoning code and the various policies that we have in place. And then we work with an applicant to bring forward their project to the planning commission or possibly city council for ultimately a decision. So for example, in reviewing tracks, we would look at distances between houses. They're called setbacks, required yard setbacks. So in a high fire hazard area, there might be an increased separation requirement, let's say 30 feet, for example, between houses, whereas in a more dense neighborhood, you might have 5 or 10 feet between houses. There's also, the fire department will review a fuel modification plan. So it's a preliminary landscape plan where they look at various zones of landscaping to prevent spread of fire. Next slide, please. There's the Redlands Municipal Code. We have California Building Code that has various requirements for high fire hazard areas. I won't go into it in detail, but it addresses landscape zones, methods of construction, such as enclosing roof eaves, protecting patios and things, other accessory structures that might burn. Next slide, please. Another term is defensible space. CAL FIRE, California Department of Fire and Forestry Protection, is really pushing this now at the local level. Essentially, there's 3 zones. Zone 1 and 2 are within about 30 feet of the house, and that's called the fire break zone. And then farther out, up to 100 feet, is a further thinning of the fuel. It's called fuel modification zones. Next slide, please. And this is just an example of a lack of defensible space, and then this might potentially happen if it's dried out and fuel, basically. Next slide, please. This is another example showing the fire break zone up to 30 feet. Keep it irrigated and the vegetation low or minimized. And then from 30 to 100 feet, further thinning of the fuel, so clearing out dead brush, dead trees, things that present fuel. Next slide, please. This is a good example of a successful defensible space. As you can see, some of the grass is burned, but there's no trees or brush or large structures, trees, what have you, that could create a fire hazard threat to that particular home. And then as you can see, this is green, so this indicates it's irrigated and being well maintained. Next slide, please. The City of Redlands Fire Department webpage, there are some guidelines for how to maintain property, mostly single-family homes in Redlands. There's fire-wise principles, there's guides to landscaping construction. All of that is on the website. Next slide, please. And last but not least, there is a new state law, so on or after July 1st, 2021, when a property is sold that is located in a high fire hazard area, the property owner will need documentation of compliant defensible space inspection. And The state is becoming more aggressive with enforcement for defensible space and fire prevention. And that's it. That'll wrap up my presentation. Thanks.
All right. So I'm your last speaker for the day, for the night. Thank you all for spending time on your St. Patrick's evening to listen to heat and how heat is going to be affecting us and what we can do about it. So no matter what you know about climate change, you likely know that there's going to be an increase in heat. In fact, that's one of the reasons why it was first called global warming, because the planet is warming. That's why it is so important for us to really focus in on heat if we are going to build resilient communities. Not only that, but we do live in a desert, so even without climate change, just get rid of it for a second, we still have high heat events. We still have hot weather that could potentially cause heat stroke, heat exhaustion, death, dehydration, all of these issues that we need to deal with as a community. So because of that, we are going to discuss 2 ways to become more resilient to heat. The first way is how to cool down our atmospheric temperature around us. And then the second way is how to prepare for any high heat events that are still going to happen. Next slide. The first way is by cooling our interior, and we can do that through cool roofs. Cool roofs can remain 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than traditional materials during peak summer weather, and we're in Redlands, we have a lot of very hot peak summer weather. Cool roof materials have a higher solar reflectance of more than 65% and transfer less than 35% of the energy to the building below them. Materials can include coatings, asphalt shingles, metal tiles, clay tiles, and concrete tiles. The benefits of a cool roof: they can transfer less heat to the building below them, less air conditioning is necessary, they can contribute to lower rates of heat-related illness and mortality, they can improve the efficiency of the HVAC equipment, reduce peak power demand, improve building comfort, extend the roof life cycle, and save money overall. So I want to direct your attention to this air conditioning one, the second one. Air conditioning is a blessing. I myself have used it many times this past few weeks because it's been hot out. However, air conditioning is a pollutant. It gives out greenhouse gas, and as we all know, greenhouse gas increases the heat. And so by excessive use of air conditioning, we are in fact making the problem worse by trying to deal with it. So anything we can do to decrease our reliance on air conditioning is going to be very, very important overall if we want to mitigate and minimize our impact on the climate. A good case study for cool roofs is Houston. Houston has added another 6 to 8 degrees of heat to the city, known as an urban heat island effect. We talked about this a little bit in the first talk if you were here, but as a refresher, or for anyone who wasn't here, urban areas are hotter than the rural areas. This is because there is a greater density of people. All of us in this room are hopefully a nice 97 degree Fahrenheit body temperature. We have cars, we have asphalt, we have roofs, we have equipment like air conditioning that gives off heat, refrigerators give off heat. All of this works together to create a hotter environment. So not only is the earth getting warmer, not only do we live in a desert, but we live in an urban desert, which means we are even hotter than the surrounding areas. In Houston, surface temperatures on rooftops can reach 160 degrees Fahrenheit or hotter, so heating the surrounding air and heating your interior. So you have to use more air conditioning. Flat or low slope roofs can readily utilize available cool roofing technology. So if you are in the market for a new roof, or you just found out tonight that roofs have a life cycle and a lifespan, and you probably should check and see if yours is coming to the end of that lifespan, or you know a neighbor or a family member that is also in the market for a new roof, maybe they're building a house, ask them to use a contractor and determine if cool roofing technology is right for them. It will save them money, and in a lot of cases, the materials for roofing, cool roofing in particular, are not any more or less expensive than roofing materials that are already available. In another vein is cool concrete. We're going from the inside to the outside. Cool concrete comes in a lot of different varieties and forms: porous concrete, interlocking concrete, cool paving, choose something non-reflective, cool asphalt, and use lighter colors to increase the asphalt's albedo. Another thing I want to direct your attention towards is the top two, porous concrete and interlocking concrete. You can see under there that they have an extra added benefit, and that is they allow stormwater to drain through the pavement. A lot of the sustainability ideas that we have and the resilience ideas that we have are multi-purpose, which means if you choose one thing to be sustainable or resilient, chances are it will have other benefits. That is very important because it means less work for us, and it also means that any work we do can be doubled in impact. Now, this is one that I think everyone probably knows about when it comes to decreasing heat, and that is to increase the canopy cover and vegetation. Increasing tree canopy cover to 25% can reduce temperatures up to 4.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Increasing canopy benefits include reducing energy usage, especially if you plant trees in south-facing windows so it can block some of the sun, which will cool down your house. They can improve public health, improve air quality, reduce stormwater runoff, and have several social benefits. These benefits include lower stress, lower anxiety, lower rates of depression, and we want happy people in our resilient communities. It isn't resilient if everyone's very depressed and stressed out. So we like that. We like the social benefits. Louisville, Kentucky is a great example of a city that is working hard to increase their tree canopy. They've been identified as one of the fastest growing and most intense heat islands in the country. Increasing amounts of stormwater overflowing sewers are causing sewage overflows and waterway pollution. So again, we see that these issues are often multi-layered, and one solution to the problem can benefit another problem. They have had a long-term, go back. We don't want to talk about Louisville, that's okay. No one likes Kentucky. The project will result in setting new long-term goals to achieve 45% tree canopy coverage. They've also identified private land, all you guys, as one of the greatest opportunities to expand our tree canopy. They've also found that partnering with large landowners like public schools to provide incentives to plant trees is a great way to increase tree canopy. One way that you can put this in your neighborhood is you can start up a group, maybe start up a GoFundMe, one of those Kickstarter campaigns. You get together, you ask for donations for seedlings and to plant trees. Just make sure that anyone who is a part of this project knows how much work it's going to be for at least 3 years, and designate individuals within your school, organization, community, neighborhood to take on this task. It doesn't work if you put the tree in the ground and then leave it. It does need at least a little bit of care. Now, if you were here for the water talk last week, you might remember something very important. Landscaping takes up a lot of water. We want resilient communities. We don't want to solve one problem by causing another problem. When you choose your trees, make sure to choose trees that are drought resistant and non-water intensive. It is also important to note that while tree canopy does decrease heat the most, it is not your only option here. Tree canopy works by creating shade and giving the sunlight something else to bounce off of other than your face. However, just planting regular plants, regular ground plants, you can have a field of agaves, it doesn't matter, that also decreases your heat. It doesn't decrease it as much, but it does decrease it a little bit. So if you're worried about really using a lot of water to keep this tree alive, you can also get some benefits by planting regular run-of-the-mill native plants. Slide. All right, so we've talked about how do we decrease our heat. However, like I said before, we do live in a desert. It does not matter how many trees we plant, how many cool roofs we put up, how many cool pavements we use. At the end of the day, there will be some days where it just gets hot. More importantly, a lot of people do not treat heat like a natural disaster. Instead, what we do, it gets to August, it's 112 degrees out, so we sit on our couch with a fan in our face, going, oh my gosh, I'm just gonna suffer, it'll be over before you know it. We're just a big sweaty mess. That is the wrong way to think about heat. Heat is a natural disaster. It can kill people. In fact, it is a weather phenomenon that is known to kill the most number of Americans every year. This is why we can't just talk about decreasing our heat. We need to talk about increasing our awareness and our preparedness for this event. You wouldn't sit on a couch during a hurricane saying, it's just gonna pass in a few weeks, I'll get over it. You prepare for it, you evacuate if you need to, you come up with a plan with your friends, family, and loved ones to make sure that everyone survives the event. Which is why we are going to do the same with high heat. First off, identify the heat threshold at which a heat emergency is declared. We mentioned before, 95 degrees is when people start suffering negative effects from heat. Just because that's when people start suffering doesn't mean that's when a heat emergency is declared. But for you and your community, you can decide when a heat emergency is declared. Is it that 95-degree threshold? Is it 100 degrees, 115 degrees? It's up to you. It's up to your risk appetite. Translate messaging on heat warnings, safety during heat events, services available, and media channels. We're very lucky in Southern California that we live in such a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. There's a lot of people here. It's really wonderful. However, not everyone speaks English as their native language or as their first language, which means sometimes messaging can get lost, especially if they're speaking a language that not a lot of government materials are made in. Which means it's up to you to talk to your neighbors, talk to your family or friends, and work with them to translate any and all materials so that they have access to the same information. Establish cooling centers, that's one of the biggest issues that we have, especially for vulnerable populations. Sometimes you do just need to get out of the heat. We would like to not use a lot of air conditioning, but sometimes you don't have any other choice. And finally, develop a database of facilities and organizations that serve vulnerable populations. The benefits of this, improved public health because people are not dying from heat, improved awareness of climate change risks, and improved coordinated responses. We like coordination in this room. Arizona is a great case study for this. They're also a desert like we are, which means they also have heat like we do. They have done a lot of work when it comes to raising awareness of heat. They've created toolkits specifically for older adults, outdoor workers, and schools. These are 3 groups that are most vulnerable to heat. They've worked with older adults to create a plan for excessive heat events. They've created a list of medications that are known to be affected by heat, like antidepressants, diuretics, sleep aids, Parkinson's drugs, high blood pressure medications. It usually says on the box at what temperature those medicines start to degrade. If you don't have the box anymore, you can call the manufacturer or look online, talk to your doctor, but this is very important. A lot of people don't know that their medications do start to degrade at a certain temperature. Very important to know. And the final way we can beat the heat is with the buddy system. Yes. First off, build a social network before a heat emergency. It does not do anyone any good if you start preparing for a heat emergency when it is August and it is 112 degrees out. At that point, it is a heat emergency. You've waited too long. Identify vulnerable residents. We shared before, schools, older adults, people who work outdoors. I would also add in pregnant women can be very vulnerable to heat. Keep that in mind. Share life-saving information prior to an emergency. Reach out to at-risk members, neighborhoods during extreme heat events. Train community organizers and volunteers on emergency protective measures and ways to assist vulnerable adults and children. Especially important to teach about heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and other heat-related illnesses. What are the symptoms and how do you treat them? And engage communities to provide protective health measures to hard-to-reach populations. This can create a greater internet connectivity of neighborhoods because you're forced to interact with your neighbors if you want this to work. It can decrease gaps in lack of information and access to resources, the most important thing. So what can you do with all this information? Just know heat waves kill more Americans than any other phenomenon every year. The buddy system will help you get help if you have a health problem or otherwise feel unwell, and it can connect vulnerable residents to people who can check in on them during heat waves and decrease risk of death. The way I like to do this is through a phone tree. How many people know what a phone tree is? Yes, we got a couple. I'm going to explain it anyways. So a phone tree, you can have your one neighbor at the very top. They get a message that says, hey, it's going to be whatever heat threshold you and your neighborhood have decided on, 95 degrees. So they will call 2 of their neighbors and ask, do they have a plan? Do they have access to air conditioning? If they don't, do they have access to a car to get them to a cooling center or like to the library if they need to? Are their medications all taken care of? Do they remember the symptoms of heat stroke and heat exhaustion and how to deal with those? Is there someone checking in on them on a regular basis until the heat event is passed? Once you've established all those and you've come up with a plan, your job's done, hang up the phone, those 2 residents can now call 2 more residents, and on and on and on until everyone in your community has a plan to deal with the heat. That is why we are doing ANCA. We want people to be resilient, and sometimes resiliency means preparing for the worst when it does happen. Fine? And so with that, I will leave you with this lovely quote. God, it was hot. Forget about frying an egg on the sidewalk. This kind of heat would fry an egg inside the chicken. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Becky Foreman. I'm a member of the ANCA team, and now we are going to have a few minutes for some questions for our panelists. So if our panelists will please come back. We'll move the microphone. And we'll move it over here. Who has a question for any of our panelists? Yes, sir.
Is there any part of the recently adopted general plan that specifically addresses climate change?
Yes, there is. There's actually a separate document called the Climate Action Plan. It was adopted at the same time with the 2035 General Plan. That was back in December 2017. And the 2 documents are linked. So many of the policies and actions in the 2035 General Plan are aimed at implementing climate action plans.
We should have that, and we should have a copy of that for this group to understand what is going on in the city or what the rules are.
Thank you.
It is on the city website. The big document.
Yeah,
But
Linda
we have
says
one
it
here
is
to,
on the-
for
That's a
people to look at.
Great suggestion.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, back here I saw a hand. I think, was there a hand back here?
No, I was just.
No, okay. I think there's a question over here.
Not so much a question. I introduced myself 2 months, the first of the meeting. I was on the street tree committee for 12 years, over a 20-year period, and we addressed the climate plan at least 10, 15 years ago. We've integrated into the city planning those concepts of resiliency, and we've been working on it in the city for decades. Your latest is absolutely wonderful. You also mentioned everybody should get together and plant trees. Please be careful about that. We've learned a lot over the last century about what trees not to plant in the city of Redlands. The Street Tree Committee and the Public Works 15, 20 years ago, we put together a list. It's a very extensive list that was helped through the University of Redlands and the University of Riverside, so that we could identify those trees that would be viable in our community to be able to take the water that was available, the sunshine, to provide us cooling. And this list database is on the website for the city. The current chairman of the Street Tree Committee is sitting right here. He came to the last meeting at my invitation, and he is here again. And he and the Street Tree, let's see, we call Eric a arborist. But Eric Reeves is identified as an arborist and works with this so that we lay out all over the entire city where we're going to plant trees, how to take out the dead trees, and keep that canopy working with the identifiable heat island effect that the University of Redlands helped us prepare for the city of Redlands. So there is a lot going on in what is called the Department of Facilities. Now, it used to be Public Works 30 years ago, and then Quality of Life. So you do have a working organization in the city that can help you. But don't run out and plant trees just because you're thinking you're doing good. They'll die. And we've had a lot of problems from the city and planting trees. We've had residents, because I've visited every service club in this community, giving presentations, and we've had residents say, I'm turning off the water, I'm not going to take care of that city tree. They go out and put dirt around the base of the tree to kill it. Then we have to sue them. You know, that's not fun. So there is help if you appropriately go to the city.
Thank you very much. Great. That's a lot of information that's available if you are interested in planting trees. So don't just go out willy-nilly. Talk to Eric. Is it Eric? Talk to the city. You'll get lots of great information. Are there any other questions? Questions for the panelists? We have time for one or two more. Yes. Oh, well, Linda and then Eric.
Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead. No.
That's all right, go ahead.
I have a scenario in my head as the temperatures increase, and at any moment in time, we could have extremely high temperatures for a few days. And if we had a brownout for a prolonged time, I'm really concerned about what we do, you know, if the temperatures are really high and we have no air conditioning, no fans, no refrigeration, basically nothing. You know, do we have sort of an emergency plan for a scenario like that?
If I can speak up again, we have a reverse telephone system from the city government that contacts individuals when we have problems. Generally, it might be because of a couple of panther cubs have come down into the school area, but they can contact everybody in the city that has a phone. Not a cell phone, but a landline.
Fewer people these days. I'd like to hear from our panelists. Anybody could address that. How would we cope with that as a community? Or
Well, I don't know a lot of detail about that specific scenario. I know that there are city departments or a department that will set up a cooling center. I believe the senior center is one option. There's a couple other places that are established as cooling centers. I can't speak specifically if there's a citywide loss of electricity. I can't speak to that scenario.
And this is one of the reasons why it is so important to prepare for this beforehand. Another scenario that's very similar is like, what if your house catches on fire? No one plans for their house to catch on fire, but you should have a plan in case that happens. So treat this scenario sort of like you would treat that. What happens if there's a brownout and I lose power? Who do I go to? How can I get in contact with people? Where can I go to get help? If you think about these scenarios before they happen, you'll be less panicked, less likely to make rash, stupid decisions, and you'll be able to survive it a lot better.
Thank you. We'll just leave that there for a minute because we do have time for one more. I think, Eric, did you have a question or comment? Please.
Exactly, Andy, but as Don alluded to, I'm a member of the Street Tree Committee. It's 7 residents appointed by the City Council. We meet every other month. And in nearly every meeting, the subject of palm trees comes up for a variety of reasons. We've all seen the big clumps dead fronds that fall down on the street or the sidewalk, and that's a concern. The city's been working diligently to reduce the number of trees that needed trimming, but the bigger question that I have is whether we should have palm trees at all. And I know at first that kind of shocks people, but most of the palms that we have in Redlands are not native to the area. They don't produce a lot of oxygen, they don't absorb a lot of carbon dioxide. They do produce a lot of dead fronds, which are expensive to clean up. Is the city considering something akin to a reduction or a moratorium on planting palms versus some other trees that would give us a greater benefit?
All right, I guess that's for you.
Not that I know of, but then again, trees, the street tree list is not in the Department of Development Services. Need to check with Facilities and Community Services Department and Eric Reeves and the committee, of course, to establish a policy that would take that direction.
Thank you. Hey, I would like to have a little more reflection on what we've heard tonight. So I would like to ask you all a couple of questions, and just anyone who would care to respond. What is something that you heard tonight that sticks with you? Something you heard tonight from anybody here that kind of stuck with you? Anybody?
Finding a buffer zone. So you have zone 1, 2, and 3 for your heat reduction.
Thank you. Buffer zone, yeah, Tommy.
More people die from heat.
More people die from heat, yeah, yes.
Have a plan in your community about how you're going to handle it.
A plan on how you're going to handle it, yes, in your community, yeah. And what did you hear tonight that concerned you, that particularly concerned you? Yes.
It doesn't sound like the city planning is doing much, or that we've learned much about what they're doing.
It seems like there's a lot more you can learn, and I think we've heard about some great resources tonight. So I'm interested in looking at all those resources. But yes, I understand that. Thank you.
I think
Yes.
the whole brownout situation, when there's like wind, they're doing it for fire protection. You know, it's like, wait a minute, it's 120 degrees out. So
Yeah.
it was kind of like, I don't know, I didn't get any notification, and yeah. So that kind of scenario has happened, but not
Yes.
on purpose. But
Yeah. So where have you experienced the impact of the rising heat, or where have you been aware of this impact causing some maybe dire consequences? Anyone with a personal experience, or you know someone who was affected, dramatically affected by the heat?
I'll just share that my kids in Portland, Oregon, which I always thought it was too hot down here, I'd go up to Portland, but they had that heat bulb, heat dome.
Dome, yeah, heat dome.
This summer, that killed a lot of people up there.
Right.
And they're an area that have very little air conditioning, so it was a very, very dangerous situation up there. That I think extended all the way up maybe to Seattle area.
I was actually visiting my father in Seattle at that time. And we actually went to Olympic National Forest, and we went to the rainforest, and it was dry and warm. So,
Yeah.
there's a hand back there, I think.
Is there somebody back here in the back? Thank you.
Fires in the Bay Area burned my friend's houses down.
Oh, wow, okay. I'm sorry to hear that. Fires in the Bay Area burned friends' houses down. Yes.
Marty, what creates a heat dome?
The heat dome. So, the funny thing, sort of like, so when you get hot, to get sort of extreme hot weather, you need the air to actually sort of be falling. And what causes sort of the air to get particularly warm is because as the air sort of is being converging and coming down, it's actually being compressed. And just like sort of if you think of it like compresses the air inside like a bicycle pump, it actually heats it up. And so those heat domes, those high pressure ridges that sort of create that heat, it is sort of, it's in addition to the solar input, it's literally sort of the atmosphere is sort of mounded up in that region. And so it's sort of being, the air sort of is literally sort of being sort of squished down. So it's a combination of solar heating as well as what's called adiabatic heating, which is the heating due to compression.
And is there a certain temperature and humidity level that sort of?
So the point where it becomes a problem is sort of right where temperature and human biology sort of intersect, right? So that's sort of 95 degree, right? So if the temperature outside is as hot or warmer than you are, your body has a real hard time maintaining temperature anymore. And so that's the real warning level. That's why I put 95 degrees as sort of the warning level of my slides when I talk about it. So it's a good nominal temperature where you should start to be concerned.
Yes.
I would just like to address also with the wildfires, obviously, the air is dirty. And there's so many people who are really affected by that and have to basically stay in and have a purifier in their house.
Right.
And it's quite often.
Air quality, yeah,
The air
definitely.
quality is a big one.
Well, before we wrap up tonight, Tyra talked a lot about having a plan. So I'm wondering, as you were listening to Tyra, and maybe also to the other presenters, what idea came to mind about something that you could do maybe on a neighborhood level to help prepare for the increasing heat that we know is going to keep coming? Anybody have an idea that they thought of while you were listening to this? What could you do as a neighborhood, maybe?
Get more phone numbers.
Get more phone numbers, yeah? And back at the back?
Probably get some backup power, like generators and things like that.
Backup power. Thank you. Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
You could take turns going into each other's house and using their air conditioner on one time and have theirs off. Everybody doesn't have a single house.
Take
They
turns making your own little cooling centers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, I want you to hold on to these ideas, remember them, and anything else you think about. When we conclude, we're going to invite you to write them on one of those papers over there. We have markers, and then you can just stick them up on that wall. The wall is sticky, so the paper will stick to it. We will record all of those and send them out to everybody. So that is, I think it is time now to turn it back over to Linda for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Becky. Okay. All right, well, first we want to thank our presenters, so let's give them a big hand for their work for us tonight. And then we want to thank the city for the use of this room. We've appreciated that so much. And also the community center staff are so great here. I don't know how many of you know them, but they're wonderful, and they work so hard to set up this room. And we want to thank all of the ANCA volunteers who help at each one of these to prepare this room and to register you and do everything that's needed to pull this off. And we want to remind you next week, the topic is, it's interesting. When I looked at the registrations, next week is the lowest week. The topic is how to reduce your carbon footprint. That's not exactly, it's not like life-threatening like some of the other things we've talked about, but man, is that important, right? We have all got to step up and take responsibility for this. So that is the topic. So I hope you will come back next week. And one of the things that we're going to do, and what I'm going to encourage you to do right now, and there's a slide. You've got it. Thank you, Wendy. Is that the one with the link? No, it isn't. Okay. There's something called the Cool Climate Calculator. And it's a really easy way that you can figure your carbon footprint. So I'm hoping that you'll all do that before you come back next week. And we're going to send you that link in your little follow-up letter that you'll get from us. So look for that. And really, it only takes about 5 minutes to calculate it. But it's really interesting to see. It'll tell you kind of where you are emitting the most emissions, and it gives you some clues on kind of what you need to do in your own, as an individual or family. So keep that in mind. And our speakers next week will be Valerie Roundtree from the university, and Brian will be here again, Brian Foote from the city. And then actually, instead of Tyra, I think you're going to be stuck with me next week on practical actions. Anyway, but we hope if you found this evening valuable, that you will, if you're on social media, post something about it. Let's encourage other people to come. And invite your friends and neighbors, especially your neighbors. I am so proud of the co-op where I live. We've had quite a few people here regularly, and we're getting a lot of excitement going. We live at the Braemar Housing Co-op, and there's a lot of people excited now about actually doing something in our neighborhood, which is basically our co-op. So invite your neighbors to come. And then finally, we want you to ask you to stay for a while, get acquainted, put your ideas up there, as Becky said, for what we can do to prepare for increasing heat. It is coming, there's no doubt about it. Take a look at that map. Look at all those orange dots on there. They're really growing, aren't they? Take a look, see how many dots are in your neighborhood. See if maybe there are some people there that you can find in this room and get to know. Check out the resource table. There's some amazing resources. And Eddie has his hand up. Eddie, comment?
Yes, I want to invite you to come and present this at the city council so that we, those are broadcast on the community channel.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they're recorded and we play twice a week. So that invitation is out there for you.
Thank you.
Present this in maybe 5 minutes.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Eddie.
It's hard, but I think that's a
Yeah.
lot of time. And I'm inviting members of the community also, when they do present, to come out and speak to the experience that you have here.
Thank you, Eddie. Yeah, any way we can build awareness. That's our big job right now, is building awareness, getting people educated. And that will lead to involvement and action, I'm convinced. I also want to put a special pitch in tonight for attending the demonstration neighborhood forum on this green poster over there. That we had to change the date on that. We realized we hit Easter weekend, which is not good. So we changed it to April 30th. But this will be your opportunity to come and check out what a neighborhood forum is and see if you can get excited about bringing that to your neighborhood. So we really hope a lot of you will sign up to come to that. And there will also be an opportunity for anybody who would be interested in facilitating these forums in the future, because we're hoping there's going to be lots of them here. We are going to offer training, and it's top-notch training in facilitation methods. So keep that in mind. If you've ever dreamed about becoming a facilitator, this is your opportunity. And then finally, if you haven't had a chance to look at this list of workshop topics, as I said earlier, we want to keep this educational activity of ANCA going and offer many different ways or many different topics for people to come and learn about climate change and what to do about it. So add your green dots there. Everybody gets 3 to choose your favorite. And I think there's a couple that have added there. Mila, maybe you could write over that with a marker so people could read that better. And there's also a place there, if you noticed, on those 8.5 by 11 sheets to sign up. If we need to start kind of building a volunteer, almost like a staff for ANCA. And so one of the groups, we'll call them like a working group, will be to plan for these monthly educational events. So we need a team of people to do that who are interested in making these events available. And then also, let's see, the second one under there, Mila, what is that bottom one say? I forgot what I put up there on that. No. Yeah.
Super Bowl party.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, yeah. Part of.
Speakers Bureau.
Yeah, part of the educational effort is a speakers bureau. So we're not saying everybody on that team to plan them has to be a speaker, but it would be good if the speakers work together with the educational teams. So again, you can write your name down there if you're interested. Remember, this is about action. Okay, I think that's all I have to say, but we have a special closing. Oh, one more, Catherine.
Please note, the March 22nd date, it will be at the Contemporary Club at the library. Don't want people confused on that.
Thank you.
And then we would love to have your feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, So, since it is St. Patrick's Day, we have a genuine Irish person in the room. And I want to ask her to come up. And she's one of our Braemar neighbors, Mary McLaughlin, and she's going to close tonight with an Irish blessing.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. And I'm sure you all know about who St. Patrick was. He brought Christianities to Ireland way back. Oh, I don't know when. And he used shamrock to teach about the Trinity. Okay, so the three leaves on one stem. So that's the actual, what it's all about. But anyway, there are many sayings in Ireland, and here is one of them. I'm sure you've all heard this one before. May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine upon your face, the rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand.